The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Souter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. I'm pretty happy in my job as an economics professor, but suppose I woke up one day and wanted to become a barber. Well, it turns out I face a challenge in starting my new career, apart from my total lack of style and sophistication. Namely, that I need to get a license by the state of Alabama. What exactly is occupational licensing, and what is the extent of licensing here in Alabama? Joining me on EconVersations today is Courtney McLeod, a policy analyst with the Johnson Center and a co-author of a new study from the Alabama Policy Institute titled "The Cost of Occupational Licensing in Alabama." Welcome back to the show, Courtney.
Thanks, great to be back.
So we want to just start by mentioning that we do have this new study that came out with collaboration between the Johnson Center and Alabama Policy Institute, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today, right?
Yes, exactly. It is a collaboration between Dr. Dan Smith and myself, and then two graduate students that helped us with the data.
Okay, so you started by talking here that for some of these professions, you're going to have to get licensed by the state. So what exactly do we mean by the licensing? Because, for instance, for some jobs, like say a doctor or a lawyer or barber or so forth, I mean, licensing doesn't sound like such a bad idea. I mean, it seems like you'd have to be pretty well trained and be pre-specialized to be able to get a job like this. So what exactly is involved with licensing by the states?
So occupational licensing is basically getting a permission slip from the government to work. In cases in Alabama, what that looks like is once someone enters a profession, they are required to have so many hours of training and hours of work and experience by the state of Alabama, and then they can apply for a license within the state to work. And this applies across a broad range of occupations. In Alabama, we license around 150 occupations.
So then, do you also have to take an exam or something? Because there's like the bar exam that you have to take. So do all these different licensed professions have some type of exam?
Yeah, this is the important distinction with occupational licensing, is that in a profession often there is some sort of governing body, so the State Bar Association, where you are required to take an exam to become licensed in that state for that occupation. But in the case of a doctor, let's say, graduating from medical school and having that experience doesn't necessarily mean that you are automatically licensed in a state. So you still have to jump through the hoops that the state puts up for you to get a medical license in that state.
So when did occupational licensing start in the United States? Is this a recent phenomenon, or does it go back a while?
Depends how you look at it, but it's gone back a little bit. Around the 1950s is when we really started to see occupational licensing grow as a practice by states. And the rationale behind it is that it protects the public safety, as well as provides information about who's providing services for you. So theoretically, you don't want a doctor who's going to sell you snake oil. If he has a license by the state, that is a signal to you that he is a legitimate doctor.
And so, that would seem like it'd be important. And then it would also be the case, like if a doctor ends up being bad, or a dentist abuses their patients or something like that, wouldn't it be possible for them to lose their license? Or, lawyers can get in ethical trouble and lose their license as well. So is that another part of this process? It
is possible to lose your license. And again, in theory, that is a way to keep licensed professionals honest in their professions by saying, if there's malpractice or something unethical that's going on, you can theoretically lose your license. But that doesn't happen in every case either.
And so how do these standards get set in the different occupations?
Standards are set by occupational licensing boards in each state. Okay. So the boards are typically made up by professionals in that occupation, and then usually there's representation from the concerned public. So there's usually a non-licensed member of that board. So for example, if there was a board of dentistry in Alabama, which there is, and I, as a citizen somehow got very interested in that, I could potentially be on that licensing board as a non-dentist, just as a sort of the consumer's perspective of things.
And when we look across the country, is occupational licensing becoming more common or less common?
It's becoming much more common. So back in the 50s, when this really became sort of a popular tactic by states, we saw, I think it was the federal government, I think they licensed like a few dozen occupations or something. And as it's grown, now we see over 20% of the workforce across the country that needs a license to work in a state.
And I know one of the economists who's written a lot, probably as knowledgeable as any, as a gentleman named Morris Kleiner, has made the point that occupational licensing is actually sort of relatively understudied by economists, especially in comparison to the effects of unionization, right?
Exactly. So it is, it's relatively understudied, which is surprising because of how popular it is nowadays. Like I said, now up from 20% of the workforce is required to get a license from the state. And again, that means application fees, that means training and experience and being able to prove that. As well as license fees and the renewal fees. And so basically it's checking in with the state over time as you remain in that profession.
So certainly, with some of these fields, like we say architect or engineer, I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable about these different fields, and I probably have a pretty hard time even trying to quiz my doctor or dentist or an architect to see if they actually knew their stuff. So at some level, I think I'd be pretty happy to have somebody to make sure that these folks are well trained. But there are some other professions that are licensed. It's not just these very high, high education, very specialized professions get licensed today, right?
Exactly. So when you think about it, it's not very controversial to say that a doctor or an architect needs a license. We feel as though that is a barrier to entry for doctors that feels good to the consumer, because you're not getting a doctor necessarily selling you snake oil. But the question then becomes whether or not occupational licensing is a way to actually reduce the number of unqualified or untrained professionals within a certain field. And so this is when we get into the scope of occupational licensing. So here in Alabama, again, we license around 150 occupations, and this goes all the way from doctors to architects down to barbers and hair braiders who also are required to meet certain standards by the state in order to work here.
And with some of these other fields, like occupations like hair braiding and barbering, I mean, it seems like the need for licensing would be a lot less, in that if I went to have an operation, I certainly wouldn't, even if I was stitched up afterwards and I wasn't bleeding, I wouldn't know for sure if the doctor actually did a good job in the surgery. So I mean, I'd really have a hard time somehow telling if I had gotten good quality of service. But I think you can usually tell if you got a bad haircut or not, right?
Exactly. So that's the other thing too, is with occupational licensing, protecting consumers against poor work is very difficult to do. And so the question again is whether occupational licensing can do that. Like you said, for example, you don't necessarily know whether a procedure was done well or not. There might be certain tells, but overall you may not know. Same with a mechanic. A mechanic may try to sell you on something that you're not technically qualified to know whether or not he's telling the truth, and you may not ever know whether or not you needed that set of tires or something like that. But when it comes to some of these occupations that you're mentioning, with hair braiding and a barber, as well as interior design, it's a pretty close. The feedback is really, really quick there. I can tell if I've had a bad haircut. And so when you get into the question of whether or not occupational licensing actually helps provide better service than you would get without occupational licensing, that's where the research is starting to emerge.
And another issue that would seem to be relevant here across different occupations is that clearly if a doctor if you have cancer and the doctor misdiagnoses it, I mean, the consequences in some fields and some professions could be life and death. But the consequences in a case. I mean, I guess a barber could clip your ear or something, but if you get a bad flower arrangement or a poor interior design, the consequences aren't nearly as dire, right?
Exactly. And so that's when we talk about the costs of occupational licensing, right, we can talk about whether or not the costs are justified within the scope of that profession. Again, going back to doctors, sort of the typical example of someone that you think, well, I'm not necessarily against him having to have a license, because then there is some sort of mechanism for you if if there's a life or death situation, the doctor malpractices, there's a way for you to go after that doctor and be able to show that he's not qualified. But in the case of, again, some of these occupations where it is easy to tell whether or not you get quality service or not, that's when you have to look into the cost. So the cost that a barber pays to maintain his license, is that really worth it? Is that worth the perceived benefit we're getting from him having a license from the state?
And in some of these cases, I mean, certainly, when I was just trying to decide what barber to go to, or who's a reliable flower shop. I mean, it's not really seems that you're even relying necessarily on the licensing. You can ask people, you can ask around and figure out who's good at some of these things, or even it applies with doctors too. There's ways which people can use word of mouth or reputation to address some of these quality issues, right?
Exactly. So especially now, some of the rationale behind occupational licensing was, this is how you tell whether a doctor is qualified or not. But in today's day and age, oftentimes we rely on third-party reviewers to tell us whether or not someone is good. So word of mouth is certainly, something that we could rely on in the past as well. If we're neighbors and I need someone to mow my lawn, you can tell me who you've used and who you like.
Right.
But in today's, with technology, that expands much further. So now I can get on my phone and I can Google who has good reviews on lawn services now. So that reputation mechanism that helps distinguish who's good and who's not at a profession has really expanded with technology, and so people are relying more and more on that to tell them whether or not someone is qualified. And I would be very interested to see any research on whether or not people know they can look at state licensing boards as a way to tell them whether someone is good or not. I certainly, if I'm going to a doctor, I don't log on to the Alabama Board of Medical Examiners or something to look up whether or not they have a license. I just go through Google reviews or word of mouth or a friend, and so that is a very primary way of people getting information. So then the question becomes, again, whether or not occupational licensing is relevant.
There's one more element of licensing that I think is important before we get into some of the more details here in Alabama, and that's the question of whether, if I didn't get that license as a getting licensed as a barber by the state, I couldn't actually work as a barber at all, right?
That's exactly right. And you certainly couldn't, run an operation. Well, you could run an operation out of your house, let's say, but the state is then allowed to come after you for not practicing with a license, and so then there are legal consequences for that as well. So really, it becomes a question of the hindrance that occupational licensing might be creating for people to work.
I guess the other last part of this that would be relevant of the consideration is, I mean, suppose if you were, maybe something like a chiropractor or even like a fortune teller or something, and you were saying like, well, one complaint you might have is that there are some really unqualified practitioners out there who are doing this, and they give everybody a bad name. And so nobody's willing to go to maybe nobody's willing to go to a chiropractor, or nobody's willing to go for massage therapy or to a fortune teller because of the quacks out there that are hurting the quality. And so, isn't there a need, at least in some of these professions as well, for one professional not just to say well, I know I'm good, but people don't know I'm good, and that there's sort of an issue here in terms of who gets to use a title to call themselves something, right?
Exactly. And an interesting question there is the use of occupational licensing to crowd out other workers. So, for example, the incentive set up, if I'm a chiropractor and I know I'm good, and I want to protect myself from other chiropractors that might not be as good as I am, or if I just simply want to be the chiropractor in town, and let's say we have a chiropractor board in the state of Alabama, and I'm on that board because I say we need to protect consumers, then I'm creating a high barrier to entry for workers. So I'm protecting my own interest, and it's not necessarily because I'm only thinking about myself, but that is the result, is that I've then created a higher barrier to entry for anyone else looking to become a chiropractor in the state, just because I want to protect myself.
Okay, so let's get into some of the details of licensing here in Alabama. One of the things you did as part of this study was to make a list or attempt to document all the different licenses, all the different occupations in Alabama that are licensed. And you were explaining before that there's actually a little bit of a challenge involved with this, right?
There is. So what we came up with for estimates, we looked at what qualifies as a license. When you talk about occupational license, a lot of people think, well, yeah, business or a license to have a business, and an occupational license actually isn't. So,
okay.
For example, if I wanted to open, let's say a flower shop, although I think Louisiana is the only state that still licenses florists, but let's say that was the case in Alabama. I would need a license to become a florist, but that does not count as my business license, my license to perform business in the state of Alabama. So when we looked at what counts as an occupational license, we really had to be careful about how we defined it, because there are other licenses involved in just setting up shop. So when we talk about occupational licensing, that's one part of work in the state, but that's certainly not all of it.
And just as a procedural question, if you're, say, working at say something like a school or insurance agency where you've got we say like licensing of insurance agents, is it the individual insurance agents that have to be licensed, or is it the business that gets licensed, or like does every agent have to be licensed, or are there any differences on this?
It's both. So if you were an individual agent, you would have to be licensed, as well as the business would have to be licensed to be able to perform business in the state. So there are levels of licensure that start to accumulate as you talk about, again, wanting to work in the state.
So I guess you mentioned a tally here, but here's just I guess to illustrate the number. How many fields in Alabama are licensed these days?
151 occupations are licensed here, and that represents around 23% of the workforce in Alabama.
And if anything, it's probably understating the impact of licensing, because if licensing keeps a few people out of practicing in these fields, these are fields that would be actually be a bit larger if we didn't have licensing, right?
Certainly. You can see, sort of grassroots business operations popping up, especially in newer fields. Or, when we talk about food trucks is always a big one, whether or not that counts as a restaurant, do you have to be licensed? And so you're really in the position of potentially limiting entrepreneurship within the state if you're creating all these regulatory barriers for people to go through in order to perform work in the state. And the costs, certainly add up over time, but just in terms of the actual scope, as you can see here with this list, it's grown quite substantial in the last 70 years.
And this is a list that keeps getting added to periodically, right? So It's not like this is stopped in time, has it?
Unfortunately, in most states, what we've seen in the last 10 years is occupational licensing has become more of a focus, especially in policy. What we've seen is that oftentimes licensing isn't reduced. It's simply the expansion is somewhat slowed. So those are kind of the good case scenarios. But yeah, so you don't often see states eliminating licenses for occupations. It does happen occasionally, as it happened in Alabama with barbers in the 80s, I believe, and then they were relicensed in 2013. So even so, sometimes it creeps back in.
We touched a little bit earlier on some of the reasons or rationales for licensing and some of the arguments against licensing, but there's another way, when you look across states, that you can see some evidence as that like some of these fields don't necessarily need to be licensed. Explain this for us.
So this is an interesting thing that came up in our research, is that, you know, if the rationale behind a license is that it protects consumers, well, licenses across states are not uniform whatsoever. So as you see in this figure, these are occupations in Alabama that are not widely licensed in other states. As you can see, locksmiths, you know, the majority of states don't license locksmiths, and I haven't seen the research, but I would guess that there's probably not a lot of damage done in those states by locksmiths. And so you have, you know, various other occupations. Auctioneers aren't licensed in 20 other states, but they are licensed here. And so when you look at it across the country, you start to see how the lack of uniformity sort of puts a hole in the argument that it's to protect consumer safety and efficiency of the workers.
And it certainly immediately answers the questions like, well, could this occupation operate without licensing? Because it clearly does in other states, right?
So yeah, there's direct proof that, you know, and again, in 36 other states, they have locksmiths. And so there's direct evidence that some of these professions don't necessarily need to be licensed. They've just become licensed as an expansion of these boards has grown under the rationale that it's protecting consumers.
Now, an occupation can be licensed, but then there's also the question of just how high the requirements to be for licensing is, right? And so does Alabama license particularly heavily these fields that we license, or where do we stack up?
For the onerous issue and whether or not Alabama, relative to its neighbors, we're bad when it comes to the most burdensome laws. So this means how high are the barriers to professions? And as you see, we're one of the worst in the country. Mississippi is right above us, but then when it comes to most broadly licensed, we actually fare pretty much in the middle of the country, and that means, you know, how many occupations do we license? So when you look at it from the broad perspective, we're doing okay, but the burdensome part is disproportionately affecting those who are licensed in the state.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that, you know, for a doctor, maybe the license isn't that important, but for some of those other professions we were talking about, I mean, those are not extremely high-paying fields, and so there's a significant burden here in terms of having to get licensed to do something, and also just the whole process of going about getting licensed. It can be hard for some people to follow. I mean, especially if, you know, you're not familiar with hiring you've never hired a lawyer, you've never gone to college. Just there can be a licensing, there can be a paperwork burden that might not seem very significant to you or I, but could be huge for some people, right?
The time and effort that it takes to be able to navigate some of the licensure laws, and you know, we can tell you from our research that it's pretty burdensome when it comes to making sure you're navigating all the rules. And that's certainly the case. $100 to a medical doctor may not be a substantial portion, but if you have someone in their community who's a natural hair braider doing it for friends and family as a business, $100 for a license, it becomes a more significant cost. So it disproportionately affects those on the lower income spectrum of occupations, and that's where we're curious to see the harm is done.
Licensing is done by the states, and so this ends up having another impact on us as a nation nationally, right? In terms of the ability of people to move from one state to another, right?
Exactly. So if I am a teacher in Alabama and I'm moving to Kansas, let's say, next week, I don't automatically get a license from Kansas because I'm a teacher licensed in Alabama. So reciprocity is something that people are looking into, states are looking into, as a way to reduce the burden on workers who are moving states, particularly for those who move often. So this is when we talk about military families being affected by occupational licensing because their spouses are moving, you know, just as often as they are, and they're required to navigate all of the rules in each state every time they move. And so reciprocity, again, is something that is an alternative to at least reducing some of the burden on workers that are licensed by various states.
And And I think it's particularly, noteworthy just because I remember, for years, people would always say like, oh, if you're a spouse of somebody in the military, then the fields like, say, teaching or insurance or real estate could be good fields to be in because they have jobs like that everywhere. But with licensing, it's not. Even though there are jobs everywhere, it doesn't mean you can actually work when you move from one state to another.
Exactly. You're still required to go through the hoops that, again, whatever state you're moving to has for that particular profession. And that, again, goes into the costs. What are the costs of actually going through the paperwork, learning the process, getting the requirements, if, they're different from the state that you're in, just, again, purely theoretically. If I have to have so many hours of experience in certain fields or so many, continued education hours, and I move to a new state where the barrier is higher, then I have to also look at, I have to perform those and bear the costs of what that is as well. And then again, if you're turning around and moving again, you have that same problem. So it creates this sort of unmeasured liability to people in terms of the cost that they face just from going through this process.
There's another element of licensing as well, and that is that people can lose their licenses. We mentioned some of the reasons, but you can also lose your license in many cases for a criminal conviction, right? You
can. So in a lot of professions, a felony conviction prevents you from obtaining a license from the state in that profession. And, again, theoretically, you can see how this would be the case for some professions. I certainly don't want a doctor who was intentionally harming patients to come back as a doctor, if he serves a certain sentence. Same with accounting, as we've talked about, if someone was working for Enron and practicing wildly unethical accounting standards, you might not necessarily want them to be able to obtain a license once they're out of prison. But we also create this cycle in the state, for example, in Alabama, where certain training programs in prisons, so cosmetology, welding, those sorts of things, oftentimes if someone goes through that training program in prison, once they're out, they cannot obtain a license from the state for that occupation because they have a conviction that prevents them from doing that. So then we're creating a cycle where, this person is going through the training program, which is provided by the state, but then they're also not able to get a license after they're out. So there's some work to be done there as well in answering the question of how do we prevent people from going back into prison, and is work one of those answers? And that is a definite yes.
And it also seems to raise issues in terms of like the fairness of a punishment, because in effect, if you, in addition to say maybe somebody serving a 2-year prison sentence for the crime that they committed, and we think, okay, that fits the crime. But then if they also lose their livelihood and their chosen profession afterwards, you've really increased the penalty for that crime, whether you intended to or whether we ever deliberated about that or not.
That's exactly right. So there are unintended penalties that we're putting on people who, go through prison and they come out and they're, technically starting a new life. But when the state says, well, you can't work in these professions that you're trained in, then we're also inhibiting them from working, which again is, when we're looking at recidivism or people going back into prison after being out, well, you have to look at whether or not the state is helping or hurting that.
Well, any sort of thoughts about licensing as we wrap up here? Whatever we talk about, that's I guess there's a lot we could still talk about because there's such a big topic. What any concluding thoughts here?
I think it's a really interesting issue because it's one that people don't really think about. We just sort of take the state boards for, we take them for being there and that's it. But when you start to hear stories of people who have been negatively affected by the state licensing boards just for wanting to practice within a certain field, then you start to see some of the real costs that we're putting on Alabama citizens and the families that are just trying to make a living and are being prohibited by the state. So watching that growth is something that I think we're really going to see a lot of in the states over the next 10 years. I think we'll see a lot of policy reform.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.